Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Spetta, the interim dean here at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. Thank you all for being here today. I am very pleased to be here for the 5th annual Lincoln Lecture on Constitutional Law. We are lucky to have as our speaker today Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard. Our own Professor Steve Calabresi will provide the formal introduction. But let me just say, it's not every day at Pritzker Law where we have a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award winner to speak to us today, and we're truly honored to have Professor Gordon-Reed with us. I would like in particular to thank Professor Calabresi, who is our Clayton J and Henry R. Barber Professor, for endowing this lecture series on constitutional law. Steve's generosity memorializes President Lincoln's connection to our law school and highlights Lincoln's early career as a talented attorney here in Chicago. Please join me in thanking Professor Calabresi for his meaningful gift. And now it's my honor to turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a great privilege to be able to work with you as my dean. I was just going to say a few words about why we have the Abraham Lincoln Lecture. And the reason is that I have long thought that Abraham Lincoln is the best lawyer president that the United States has ever had. And I think he is, along with George Washington, one of the two greatest presidents in American history. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, Lincoln brilliantly pointed out all the many ways in which the US Supreme Court's Dred Scott v. Sanford case was wrongly decided, and he argued in almost every speech that that decision was repugnant and ought to be overruled. In doing this, Abraham Lincoln set a lawyerly standard for how to fight back against an unconstitutional ruling by the Supreme Court. In his first inaugural address, President Lincoln made a constitutional case as to why unilateral secession of the Southern states was unconstitutional. He pledged to win what he called the War of the Rebellion, and he lived long enough to see that victory achieved. The US Supreme Court ultimately wrote Lincoln's theory as to why unilateral Southern secession was unconstitutional into its case law in Texas v. White, which described the Union as being, quote, an indestructible union of indestructible states. Abraham Lincoln's legal theory on the unconstitutionality of unilateral secession from his first inaugural address is now enshrined in US Supreme Court case law. Most important of all, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, freed between 3 and 3.5 million of the 4 million Black Americans who were enslaved at that time in the United States, earning Lincoln the well-deserved title of the Great Emancipator. In part as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, free African Americans and Black Americans constituted 20% of the Union Army, which crushed the Southern Rebellion. The contribution that the freed slaves made to crushing the War of the Rebellion is not as widely appreciated as it should be. The Emancipation Proclamation was a lawyerly, presidential issued document, and it was not an act of Congress. It is without a doubt the greatest presidential executive order in American history. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the War of the Rebellion from being a war to keep the Union together into a war to free the slaves. It's no accident that in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was enacted with Lincoln's help in getting the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives. But unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated before the states had ratified the 13th Amendment. The Northwestern Pritzker School of Law is descended from a law school founded in 1859 as the Union College of Law of the old University of Chicago. And that law school canceled classes for a week so its students could go to federal court to watch Abraham Lincoln argue a case in federal court. Our faculty in 1858 recognized Lincoln's extraordinary talents as a lawyer in canceling classes for 5 days in this fashion. Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, completed his study of law and received his law degree from the old University of Chicago Law School in 1866, which in 1873 became affiliated with Northwestern University, and which in 1891 was absorbed into Northwestern University, assuming its current name of the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. I've endowed this lectureship in constitutional law in Abraham Lincoln's name because of his Northwestern ties, because he was a brilliant lawyer, and most important of all, because he was the great emancipator who ended slavery and kept the Union together by crushing what he and I both call the War of the Rebellion. I admire Lincoln immensely, and I hope that this gift will lead to Lincoln's lawyerly legacy being better appreciated. We have, as Dean Speta said, a very, very distinguished guest to give the Lincoln Lecture today, and she's going to engage in a conversation with me about Lincoln and Reconstruction and other issues growing out of that. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard. Professor Gordon-Reed has won an astonishing 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008 for The Hemmingses of Monticello and American Family. And I want to hold up a copy of The Hemmingses of Monticello and American Family here and urge you to buy it and read it because it's one of the best books on American history that I've ever read. In addition to articles and reviews, Professor Gordon-Reed's books include a book on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, an edited book on Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American Society, a biography of President Andrew Johnson, which I also have with me. He's one of the main villains who we're talking about today. And then most recently, Professor Gordon Wood has, together with Peter Onoff, written Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. Professor Gordon-Reed was the Vivian Harmsworth Visiting Professor for American History at the University of Oxford, Queen's College, from 2014 to 2015. She was the 2018 to 2019 president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And a selected list of her honors includes that she is a Guggenheim Fellow in the Humanities. She holds a MacArthur Fellowship. She has received the National Humanities Medal, the National Book Award, the Frederick Douglass Book Award, the George Washington Book Prize, and the Annisfeld Wolf Book Prize. Professor Gordon-Reed was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011, and in 2015, she was elected as a member of the American Philosophical Society. Please join me in giving Professor Gordon-Reed a very loud round of applause and thanks for being one of the most distinguished people to ever speak to our community. So thank you, Professor Reed.
You're very welcome. I'm very happy to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Good. I don't know if you had some things that you wanted to say at the outset, or whether I should begin with a question or topic, I guess.
Just to thank you for this lectureship. This is a wonderful thing. Lincoln, I believe, was our greatest president, and in an incredibly difficult time, one of the most amazing people that we've had. I often think of, well, I write a lot about Jefferson, who had, for his time and in his place, a first-rate education, the best schools that Virginia could offer from the time he was a boy, studying Latin, Greek, all of those kinds of things, and was a pretty good writer after all of that. Lincoln, who had none of those things, was an excellent writer himself. And you wonder, I mean, you know lots about Lincoln, and I just wonder where that came from. You know, the Bible, Shakespeare, those were influences for him. But to see those two people, those two presidents, and to see the difference in their training, but see the outcome is just amazing to me. So I'm very honored to be here to be a part of this lectureship.
It is astonishing to think that Lincoln became such a great orator and such an effective president and politician,
Mm-hmm.
his humble origins. And it's, truly, the ultimate American success story.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I was struck by in reading your book about Andrew Johnson, who unfortunately succeeded President Lincoln as president, was that Andrew Johnson also came from a very limited background,
Mm-hmm.
but he never overcame that background in the way that President Lincoln did. And as a result, he became a force for malign evil, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered whether you might want to maybe say a bit about the contrast between Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln, as well as their similar starting point in poverty,
Mm-hmm.
and then a little bit about Reconstruction and its legacy for us today.
Well, it's an interesting point. They came from similar backgrounds. They were poor people. Andrew Johnson was apprenticed to a tailor when he was a young boy, along with his brother. They ran away from the apprenticeship. There's a runaway ad for him. You think about a president of the United States, a future president of the United States who has a runaway ad associated with him, almost as if he were like an escaped enslaved person. And it happens quite a bit. His hard scrabble background, his climb. I mean, you try to find something to admire about this person. You can look at the fact that he was very, very hardworking. He occupied almost every rung of the political ladder, alderman, mayor, and worked his way up to being president. Became president under unfortunate circumstances, but he was in the position to do that, to have that happen to him. And Lincoln had a similarly hard scrabble background, not apprenticed in the same way. I don't want to psychoanalyze people, but sometimes biographers end up doing that. But you marvel at how two people can have similar circumstances, and it takes them, they learn different lessons from it. I mean, Lincoln's background, this could have been born in him, it could have been because of his mother and stepmother, had empathy for people. You know, he talks about seeing enslaved people shackled, and what that meant to him. Johnson, maybe it's because he was the feature of a runaway ad, resented African American people. You know, he wanted to try to distance himself from the people who were closest to him, and that would have been other poor African Americans, in a way that made him really hateful towards African Americans. So, you know, sometimes the hard upbringing can make you sympathetic, empathetic, and sometimes it could make you hard. And that's what happened to Andrew Johnson. Very deeply insecure. He learned to read when he was a late teenager. His wife taught him how to write. So you think of a white man in those circumstances, feeling looked down upon by other people, and he just never seems to have gotten over it. It was his upbringing crippled him, as you said. He didn't grow beyond that. Now, that could be Lincoln's genius, not just in terms of his intellect, but his emotional EQ, as they say, was fed by this. And it went in the opposite direction for Andrew Johnson with disastrous results. I mean, the amazing thing about this is these two people were connected. We had Lincoln, and then he's followed by this person, not, you know, 4 presidents later or 4 before, one right after the other. So you can see the stark comparison right there. And it was a tragedy for the nation that he came after Lincoln.
Yes, absolutely. President Johnson, after succeeding President Lincoln, took a whole series of actions which have continued to have consequences to the present day. Encouraged the southern state governments to reform and elect officers. Southern governments did that and elected a whole bunch of Confederate Army officers to their legislatures. They passed statutes called the Black Codes that basically made it a crime not to have a job. and the only job that was available was picking cotton on a plantation for $1.25. President Johnson, after the Civil War, simply let the Southern slave owners walk back onto their plantations and own them, when in fact the people who'd farmed those plantations were the freed slaves. And in my view, I think there should have been major land reform in the wake of the Civil War. I mean, many so-called radical Republicans called for 40 acres and a mule, but the basic idea of breaking up the plantations is a very sound one. Johnson seemed to think that once slavery had been abolished, that was it, and there was nothing more that needed to be done. And we're living today with the consequences of that. So I wondered if you wanted to say anything about Johnson and the veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1865, or the failure to enact land reform, or the just letting the planters go back on the plantations as if nothing had happened.
Well, Johnson had originally been someone who was an object of fear of the planters, because when he came on the ticket, he had been adamant about, treason must be punished. And he was going to go after the planter class. I mentioned before his insecurity. He was not only insecure about his position relative to blacks, he was insecure about his position relative to the Southern grandees. He hated them. He thought that they were the enemy, and this was an opportunity for him to get back at them. But once he got to be president, and he realized what the so-called radical Republicans wanted to do, that is to say, bring African-American people into citizenship, not just to free the slaves and have them living, like peasants or whatever on plantations, former plantations, but to actually bring Black people into citizenship. And then he decided there, rather than have that happen, he was able to bury his enmity towards the planter class, and as you said, put them basically back in place. And so there were these, obviously, the legal battles with the Republicans and his attempt to thwart everything they did. But it was really his recalcitrance, more than, in addition to the letter of the law, it was his holding out hope. And this is the word that in some of the letters to him, or some of the letters that people wrote about this. I remember when I was doing the book, some of them, I read a couple of letters in which people said he held out hope to us that there could be a white man's government. So they would have been, he said, this person said, we would have accepted any terms that they gave at the time, but he held out the hope for a white man's government. So his change of heart about the Southern leadership and the Southern grandee planters, his decision to put them back in place and to sort of, be in opposition to the Congress, gave hope to whites in the South who were not willing to give up. And so he sparked the spirit, for these people to keep the spirit of resistance to all the things that were taking place. So, as you suggested, we're still living with all of this because, people say in his recalcitrance eventually led to the 14th Amendment, and that was great. But just think about what would have happened if there had been a president who was willing to engage in the sort of reformation, sort of reconstruction, rebuilding the South, and rebuilding the South with blacks as citizens, with economic opportunities, with farms. Land at all of American time was seen as freedom. It was the thing that people wanted. If you could, grow your own food, tend your own crops, you had independence from people, and that's exactly what they did not want. What the Southerners did not want African American people to have. So Johnson's holding out against that, created, his sort of far-rippling effects, your Black economic underdevelopment, all of those kinds of things start in this particular moment when they did not do what would have been the normal, the rational thing to do at this point. If they really wanted to build the South up, make the South a prosperous place for everybody, not just for a handful of people, would have been to enact land reform, let African Americans have a measure of freedom, their measure of freedom that others had, and to live as citizens in the country. And he fought against that. And we took us for, Thurgood Marshall said this, and I think in one of the Dissent of Baki, that if some of these things had been taken care of during that time period, we would have been in a better situation than we are today.
Right. So yeah, I think, for example, particularly with land reform, I've been very influenced by a book which I recently read, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, A
Mm-hmm.
Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America.
Mm-hmm.
And Rothstein in that book says that not only was there not land reform in the wake of the Civil War, but in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, the Federal Housing Authority was continuing to steer white veterans from World War II toward some neighborhoods and Black veterans from World War II toward other neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Association and the Works Progress Association and the U.S. Housing Authority were all basically encouraging residential segregation. And I mean, one of the things that strikes me about American society today is that there is so much residential segregation in American society today. Rothstein claims that we're more segregated by residentially today than we were even 100 years ago, or than we may have been during the era of the Civil War. All of this is a long legacy from Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction down to the present, but it's one of the compelling problems I think the country faces.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this notion of, well, during slavery, of course, Black people and white people in the South lived very close to one another because of the nature of slavery required that.
Sure.
The Jim Crow system that grew up after that as a measure of control, as a measure of sending a message about Black inferiority, and that Blacks were second-class citizens. I mean, that's really what Johnson was arguing for. He said, you know, if he was at first not opposed to slavery, but then when he realized that had to happen after the Black soldiers had contributed in the way you said during the war effort, he reconciled himself to that. But he said, you know, essentially Black people can be here, but they have to be on a bottom tier. And policies from, you know, the Black codes that you were talking about to later on Jim Crow, to the federal government participating in fostering segregation, you know, well into the 20th century. All of those things are of a piece with one another. The notion that we're here, but we're not fully citizens. We are second-class citizens. And that's the source of a lot of problems that we have today. And we're still actually kind of fighting that battle. I have no doubt that it is much more segregated today. Things are more segregated today than they would have been in years past, because the legacy has never been challenged adequately, and people have not stood firm on that question.
Even today, there's a kind of sanitizing of the history of the period, which bothers me. I very much believe with Lincoln that the war should be called the War of the Rebellion, not the Civil War. Civil War was a compromise title that Southerners came up with that somehow made it more acceptable. Southerners like to foster a myth that there was two heroic generals, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, on either side. The fact is that Lee was a traitor and could easily have been hung for treason, as were Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens and the other high officers of the Confederate government. Woodrow Wilson has taught us all the history that Ulysses S. Grant was a corrupt carpetbagger and a bad president, and that the only good president between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt was Grover Cleveland, a Democrat. I think this is completely wrong. I actually think Ulysses S. Grant was a great hero because Grant tried, in my view, for 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, when he left office, he tried to fulfill Lincoln's legacy as best he could. Apparently, when Congress refused to seat the Southern delegates that were elected in December 1865, Uh, Grant's biographer, Gene Edward Smith, says that Andrew Johnson wrote Grant a note and asked him if the Union Army would force Congress to seat the Southern delegates. And Grant wrote back a note saying, no, the Union Army will protect the Congress as it's currently assembled, and it will not force the seating of the Southern delegates.
Mhm.
That's practically a coup d'etat. It's a coup d'etat almost in
Mhm.
all but name. I mean, formally Johnson is president, but it's Grant as general who's saying Congress consists of the northern and loyal states to the Union,
Mhm.
and that Grant continued to try in his presidency not only to get the 14th Amendment adopted, but to get the 15th Amendment adopted, giving African Americans the right to vote. And he kept Union troops in the South until 1876, which protected some measure of freedom until, unfortunately, they were forced out. I'm just curious to know what you think about the role of Grant during this period of time, and also about the this sort of the account of history basically I'm offering here, whether
Well,
we have a false account of history and that it's a mistake to call the Civil War a civil war instead of the War of the Rebellion.
the War of the Rebellion, or I guess war between the states is what they say in the South or whatever. And there's a move now to start not talk about the Union Army, to talk about the Army of the United States, because that sort of puts Unions and Confederates, it sort of evades what's going on here. You're not thinking about the fact that these are people who are firing on the American flag. They're firing on soldiers of the American Army, which is why it seems to me such an affront to have statues of Confederate soldiers in public places, not talking about battlefields or cemeteries, but in public squares, people who fought against the United States of America. It really doesn't make any sense. So I think that, Grant is sort of enjoying a revival now, as a matter of fact. People are beginning to take a different look at him, because the story of Grant is sort of wrapped up in the whole Dunning School of Reconstruction, sort of rewriting the story, a history of that time period, to make the South heroic and to make the heroes of the North villains in these situations. And Grant has suffered because of that. There was corruption in his administration, as there have been in other administrations, but it was not about him. This is a person who, as you said, did try to uphold the legacy of Lincoln, who did try to go with the natural inferences of what the 13th Amendment, what those amendments and what the whole struggle was about, in trying to bring Black people into citizenship, fighting against the Ku Klux Klan, doing all kinds of things to basically to fulfill the promise of make the war and its aftermath have a meaning. And so I definitely think he is someone who has been vilified unjustifiably in history, and it is part of the Dunning. For people who don't know, the Dunning School, the school of historians out of Columbia University, which basically said Reconstruction was a huge mistake. All the Black legislators were people who couldn't read and write, and all those things that were not true, and that they were trying to fight against Black domination. What it really meant was Black political power in places where Blacks outnumbered whites, and in a democracy, in a Republican democracy, they voted and they put people in office. That's what's supposed to happen. That was seen as horrendous by many people, and historians wrote a story about that time period, including Grant, that was meant to basically discredit them. And so I am happy to see now that there's a different look at Grant, and there's a different look at the legend of Robert E. Lee as well. That we're not just thinking about the honorable soldier and benevolent slave owner, those kinds of things. And we're really getting down to figuring out what actually happened during that time period. And also to compare their values to ours. I mean, nobody's going to stop writing about Robert E. Lee. He's a figure of history that we will know about. But you have to realistically say what they stood for. And I'm glad you mentioned Alexander Stephens, because the Cornerstone speech in
hideous.
which he basically says, they reject Jefferson
Yeah.
and say, the Declaration of Independence, he believed that he was wrong. All men are created equal, that slavery would eventually go away. He says, no, this is what we stand for. They say explicitly that we stand for African inferiority, that blacks were meant to be enslaved to whites. And that was the basis of that society. And we don't focus on that. We focus on the notion of the heroic soldier and the sacrifice of soldiers, which we understand that, and that's important. But what were they fighting for? And the documents of the Confederacy tell you flat out what they were fighting for. And we have to ask ourselves, are these things that we agree with? I mean, do you agree with that? So yeah, this is a time for reassessing all of this. And, I'm for full and frank discussions about this, but we got to do it with everything on the table.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I've always thought Alexander Stephens's cornerstone speech expresses the complete evil of the Confederacy, because it says the cornerstone of the Confederacy is that it's founded on the principle of racial inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, Stephens absolves Jefferson and the framers by saying they thought slavery would wither away. They thought all men were created equal. They thought it was a temporary institution. They were wrong. The Confederacy is founded on the true answer, which science has provided to us, which is that one race is superior to another race.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of Stephens's exoneration of Jefferson as a person who you've written such a tremendous amount about? I mean,
Well, it's
Jefferson's
interesting.
such a complex figure in our history, and of course, you're the Jefferson expert in the country. So curious.
Well, I don't know. Is exoneration? He basically said they were kind of pathetic. I mean,
Yeah,
that they
yeah,
just don't understand. They didn't understand, and so that's that was like their children. He's sort of a wave of a hand there. But I think that was sort of an accurate description of it, in the sense that I know Jefferson thought that slavery was a backward institution and it would go away. He had no idea about how to do it, which Stephen says here. They didn't know what to do, and because I don't think slavery could have ended. And historians are never supposed to talk about inevitability, but it's hard for me to see how slavery could have ended any other way than how it ended in the United States at that time. And Jefferson and none of those people were about to say, yeah, we're going to go to war about this. That's never going to happen. But it's a very, he sort of gives them short shrift. He makes them seem like, Stevens makes them seem like they're kind of, well, they're naive. They're naive people, dreamers. And, this is the reality. And that's why that speech, I think you're right, it is to say so blatantly. And then they have the Constitution, the Confederate Constitution. People, there's a big fight now, I'm sure you probably know about, between Sean Wilentz and others. Sean Wilentz, who is convinced that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, can be described as an anti-slavery document. And other people say, George Van Cleve and others who say, no, it promotes and protects slavery. But what Stevens suggests is that this was ambiguous. The Southerners had one idea about it, and the North had another idea about it. And so now we're going to clear it up once and for all, that African slavery is a part of our Constitution, and we're going to prevent people from making any change to that. So this organization that's supposed to be founded in freedom for people will not allow that particular change in circumstance. So yeah, I think you're right. Looking at those documents, you can sort of see exactly what they wanted, and you have to ask the people who are romanticizing them, what about that? Not the hoop skirts, not the gray uniform, not the moonlight and magnolias. I mean, this is the real thing. And what do you think about it?
Right. Right. I mean, in talking about the statues in the South, I mean, I guess the comparison that comes to mind for me as the son of an Italian Jewish person who fled Italy at the age of 9 at the beginning of World War II, I think of what we did after World War II in Germany, which is we denazified it. And there are no statues of Nazi leaders in Germany. The people were caught, tried, and hung. There was a complete, thorough denazification of Germany after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, there wasn't the same kind of denazification of the South. In fact, to the contrary, the planters were invited right back into their plantations with all of their privileges, except for their slaves. And they then created a system of essentially peonage, which lasted until the 1920s and 30s and the Great Migration.
Mm-hmm.
And the system of peonage, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, is they made it a crime not to have a job, so they enacted vagrancy laws.
Mm-hmm.
The only jobs that were available were working for $1.25 an hour on a cotton plantation. If you had to sign a year-long contract to work on a plantation, and if you broke your contract, you were guilty of fraud and were sent to prison and made to work on a chain gang.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that system of peonage is essentially slavery in all but name. And then they got rid of, for a long time, African Americans in the South were able to vote after Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
But by the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, they were able to get rid of that as well by adopting voting laws saying you could register to vote if your grandfather had registered to vote, but otherwise you had to take a test in French to register to vote, and things of that kind. Do you think the system of peonage that succeeded slavery and the elimination of the vote was, in essence, almost as bad as slavery itself? And how would you comment on that?
Well, I mean, one of the letters that I mentioned before, some of the letters that were written during the time of Andrew Johnson and the Southerners and their response to him, one of them said, we were trying to get things back as near to slavery as possible.
Right.
And peonage was that. It's something as near to slavery as possible, not auctioning off children or husbands and wives, but in effect, a similar kind of system, a thing that kept people down. I happened to be tooling through Ancestry.com a few weeks ago, and I found my great-great-grandfather's voter registration on a voter registration list in Texas in 1867. And of course, I know that by 1870, Reconstruction is over in Texas, and they begin the whole redemption business, and all of that's over. But it was a time of promise for people that Reconstruction that just sort of ended, and people were put back into a situation where they were virtually under the control of white people in these rural areas. And that's why, as you know, and you mentioned the Great Migration, people literally escaping from the South because of the harshness of the rules there, and feeling that the progress that they had looked forward to had not come to fruition, and that things were actually going backwards in a way, certainly with imprisonment and lynching, all those kinds of things that were taking place in the South that made life difficult for African Americans.
Right. One great achievement of Reconstruction was Congress in 1875 passed a Civil Rights Act, which would have banned discrimination in theaters and places of public amusement and recreation. But of course, the Supreme Court held the act unconstitutional in 1883 in the civil rights cases, thereby postponing for 100 years what was accomplished in part by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's just another measure of how much promise there was and how much was lost.
Well, I think those kinds of things are important for us to point out, that even in the worst times, there were people who were trying to do something different. You sort of think of the past as everybody's retrograde, everybody's totally racist, and there was nothing. No, people were trying to do things that could have made a difference. And as we know, history there's no inevitability to it. Things could always have been different. They could have taken a different route. And that's why it's important, I think, for citizens today who are looking at a situation to say, we can affect this. no, we don't have to go any direction. And because there have been people in the past who risked a lot and put a lot of energy into trying to make things different. And it's a continuing struggle. We've always had allies. I mean, I could say there were whites along the way and Blacks who had the means, who actually stood up against the forces that would have tried to keep Blacks down. And we suffered defeats and some victories, but it's not inevitable.
What do you think of Princeton University's recent decision to change the name of the Woodrow Wilson School? Woodrow Wilson in 1913 segregated cabinet departments by race for the first time. From 1865 to 1913, Blacks and whites worked together for the federal government. Wilson ordered the screens be set up separating them. He had a showing of the movie A Birth of a Nation. He was obviously very racist, even by the standards of his time. Does that suggest that society can sometimes rot as well as sometimes progressing?
Well, I think that was a tougher question for me than there was a dispute at Yale about Calhoun, who did not have the kind of connection to Yale that Woodrow Wilson obviously had to Princeton. I mean, he was the president. He made modern Princeton into a great institution. He was the president, the League of Nations, precursor to the United Nations and so forth. So it was a tougher question, but if they want to change the name of it, then that's fine. I mean, we changed the names of buildings at colleges. I remember we recently, some years ago, changed the name of the dining hall at Dartmouth. When I was there, it was Thayer. And, I sort of, had a little harumphing about that. And so I realized that Thayer was not the original name. 50 years before that, it was something else. So, I understood the struggle they had over the dorm. I think was particularly problematic because it would be tough to make Black students stay in a dorm named for this person. But it's a tougher situation than if a person has a tangential connection. But Wilson is bad enough. There's enough about Wilson to justify making a change.
Yeah. My take on Calhoun was that he never did anything constructive in his life, never came up with any good ideas.
Oh, he didn't. I mean, he's treated as this theorist, it's like concurrent majority. Yeah. But I think we could do without him.
Yeah, that one was a no-brainer. Well, I think we're at the point where we're supposed to invite questions from our audience, and I'm not quite sure how mechanically that's going to happen. I've opened the participant list to see if there are questions, hands raised on the participant list. Do any of
question section.
There's a question. I don't actually see the question section.
Well, there's
Okay.
First question. You want me to do them?
If you can see them and would do them, that would be great.
Sure,
I'm so sorry.
sure.
I apologize.
Thank you, Professor, for being with us. What can you tell us about President Lincoln as what we would today understand as a queer person, particularly his relationship with Joshua Reed and how that might have informed his contribution to justice, law, and leadership? I don't know that Lincoln was a queer person. I mean, the reason that people suggest that he may have had same-sex relations, which at the time, the notion of queer would not have been something that he at his time would have been in, would have existed in the way that we think of it. But I don't know that we have any strong evidence that that's true. I mean, the evidence that is cited is that he and Joshua Speed shared a bed for, when they were working together. But that was not an uncommon thing to do. So I don't know. I guess I should pull back and say I don't know enough about that to be able to answer that particular question. But I haven't seen anything that is definitive or certainly that would make me think that he would have been queer in the way that we think of it today, which is a modern conception. So what's the other?
Yeah.
What measures does Professor Gordon-Reed think Congress is not making in this era that will resonate 100 years from now? as Justice Johnson's failure to pursue progressive measures after the Civil War still resonate. Well, we're having a big battle about healthcare now. Whether or not the United States is going to join other countries, other industrialized countries, in providing for healthcare for all of its, making it a right for all of its citizens. And I don't know how that's going to turn out. We'll find out November 3rd what the probable future would be. But I would say healthcare would be an area that people in the future will look back on, depending upon what we do. Certainly climate change is an area that, you know, Congress may or may not do anything about. We as a society may or may not do anything about, which will have repercussions later on. It's hard to, you know, it's hard to say, but those are the two that come most immediately to my mind at this point.
Professor Gordon-Reed, can I ask you a question? Just
Sure.
intervening. There's of course been tremendous discussion about the criminal law and the need for reform in the criminal law. And I personally favor major reforms in the criminal law. I would substantially end the war on drugs, which I think has led to mass incarceration. I would eliminate mandatory bail, mandatory minimum sentences. I would reduce cash bail. I think I would require assistant U.S. attorneys to do some criminal defense work before they work as a prosecutor, so they know what it's like to be on the defense side of a case. And I also wonder whether Congress shouldn't use its authority under Section 2 of the 15th Amendment to simply ban felon disenfranchisement laws. I also wonder about getting rid of absolute and qualified immunity for the police. Those are relatively recent Supreme Court creations. They seem to be like things that we could get rid of.
Yeah, the last one is sort of interesting, how it has become so accepted, you know, even among people who are constantly saying this thing is not in the Constitution, that thing is not in the Constitution. That's wholly judge-made, as you know. I mean, qualified immunity. All of those things are the criminal justice side. All of those things are issues that in the future, if we're not handled the right way, people could look back on it and say, you know, we could have taken a different route, and the country would have been better.
Yeah, I have some questions for you here that are finally coming through on my feed. So one question is, President Johnson issued a huge number of pardons to white Southerners. And it's unclear whether Lincoln would have done that or not. Lincoln talked about malice toward none and charity toward all. What do you think about Johnson's use of the pardon power? What do you think Lincoln would have done if he'd lived with the pardon power? How does that factor in, do you think?
Well, you know, this goes back to what we were saying before about how Johnson turned on a dime about the Southern grandees once he realized that the so-called radical Republicans were trying to remake the South and bring blacks into citizenship. You know, what people have asked me this before, what would Lincoln have done? You know, so putting on my hat here, my crystal ball, and trying to look back at it. Johnson had lots of information about what was going on in the South.
Yeah.
You know, the Southerners unleashed a torrent of violence on the freed people after the end of the war, just, you know, shooting people down for basically looking at it the wrong way. People talked about seeing bodies floating in the river in Texas and coming to a town with men, women, and children hanging from trees, you know, and Johnson still continued on that, on his policy. He knew the violence that was going on. If Lincoln could have heard about all of that and responded as Johnson did, then he wouldn't have been Lincoln.
Right.
You know, so it's, so my thinking of this is not just that he was trying to be, people say that, well, Lincoln was trying to be conciliatory towards the South, and he was, because he wanted to end the war. He was trying to find some way. That's why he ends up with Johnson on the ticket, to have a person, the only Southerner, even from a border state, who remained loyal to the Union, to say, look, symbolically, we can do this. We can get together. We can do it. But I don't know that he would have kept that up if he had known how people were being murdered, in the
I,
South,
I
just for
completely,
nothing. So I don't think it would have been the same.
yeah, I completely agree with you. I think what you said early on about Lincoln being a very empathetic person would have come to the fore, and I think he would have identified with the victims of that kind of violence. So
Hmm.
Catherine Nardi has a question, which is, what measures do you think Congress is or is not making today that will resonate 100 years from now,
Hmm.
just as Johnson's failure to pursue progressive measures after the Civil War still resonate?
Yeah, well, I think I sort of answered that before when we were talking about
Healthcare.
the healthcare and so forth. Is that, you know, the steps that we're taking now or not taking right now will determine the course of American life. And the healthcare one is one that this is very controversial at this point. That seems to me uh, to be, along with the ones that you mentioned about criminal justice and so forth. But this is such a part of American life where people are fearful of going bankrupt, of losing everything
Right.
because of healthcare costs. And so I think that those are the areas that I think we should look to as equivalent to the kinds of mistakes and the sort of direction, sort of miscues that took place during Johnson's time.
Right. One of the great puzzles, I don't know if you can shed light on it or not, but one thing I've been hugely puzzled by is I understand Lincoln was behind in the election of 1864, and it actually looked as if he was going to lose the election. And he decided not to keep his vice president from his first term, Hannibal Hamlin, who was a Republican senator from Maine, who would have been a great president, but instead, as you said, to reach across the aisle to Southerners and
Hmm.
run on a Union ticket with the only Southern Democratic senator who'd stayed loyal to the Union. Um, and as it happened, General William Tecumseh Sherman won huge victories in September and October of 1864, and so Lincoln won quite comfortably, but at one point it really looked as if he was going to lose. Do you know whether Lincoln considered any other possible candidates other than Andrew Johnson as a unity candidate, or how much Lincoln knew about Johnson? It's obviously was a very fateful choice.
Hmm.
One can see Lincoln's desperation in making the choice, but it's one that certainly had huge consequences.
I tried to find that, and no other sources that I could determine definitively explain beyond the idea of wanting unity for picking Andrew Johnson. As I said, Andrew Johnson, before he becomes president and realizes what is going on, uh, the possible transformation of the South and race relations in the South, he seemed like a good person.
Yeah,
In fact, the radical Republicans were happier, were happy with him because
right.
he was sounding such a hard line about treason must be punished. And he, before then he seemed like an ideal kind of person.
Yeah,
But that flaw that we talked about from the beginning, that the insecurity, the deep hatred of racial of blacks. I mean, his secretary says that at some point, I'm afraid the president has an unconquerable prejudice against Negroes. Even people at the time noticed it, that this was over the top
right.
for him. So I think I haven't been able to find anything other than the political expediency of it. It seemed like Hamlin doesn't bring as much to the ticket
Sure.
as a Southerner, as symbolically as a Northerner and a Southerner, or Westerner, Northwesterner, standing together to bring the Union back together. It was really the symbolism of it, and Andrew Johnson had a reputation as a seriously pro-union person, and was against the South.
Did Andrew Johnson, the two things about Andrew Johnson have always interested me. One is that apparently he got rip-roaring drunk at his inauguration as vice president, and this caused huge public embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is that in campaigning against the Reconstruction Congress, he did a swing around the circle where he traveled around the country arguing for racism, basically. And as a result, the Republicans won huge majorities in 1866, which enabled them to pass the 14th Amendment.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering what you think about either of those two episodes. I mean, in some ways, Johnson's swing around the circle made possible the passage of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, well, the inauguration, he said that he was sick,
Yes.
and he was sick, and he took or drank whiskey for medicinal purposes, and kind of overdid it, and gave a pretty bad speech. You know, whatever, the kind of thing where people would be, you know, head in hands, looking down at their feet in embarrassment, kind of thing. And Lincoln is there, obviously. So, yeah, there was that, and he got a bad reputation from that. He did the swing around the circle. The thing about him, he never wrote down his speeches because, as we know, he learned to write as an adult, and his wife taught him how he learned to read as an adult. His wife taught him how to write, so he was not comfortable doing that. But he was a great speaker. That's really what made his career, that he could, in fact, give good speeches. And the swing around the circle was essentially just a tour in which he was saying outrageous, crazy things, not just racist things, but, you know, profanity, intemperate language about his opponents. And of course, it was a great spectacle because people like car wrecks. Some people like car wrecks, but it didn't really help him. It didn't help his party very much, and it was a disastrous decision on his part.
Yes. No, I think that's absolutely true. One thing that I think Lincoln did that was subtle and very successful, which might be a good note to end on, is Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address talked about the Declaration of Independence. And he said, 70 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
We are met on a great battlefield of a war to determine whether a nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Does Lincoln, by doing that in the Gettysburg Address, transform the Declaration so that it clearly applies to Black Americans as well as to white Americans?
Well, that's what he was hoping to do, because that's what the struggle was about. He understood that once this war was over, we're going to have to rebuild society. And by then, he knows Black people are going to be here after, you know, having fought and all of the sacrifices made. Yeah, that was the attempt to sort of have it apply to everybody, and not just as a universal principle, but actually it becomes a political thing at that point, because you have to remake the government. You have to remake voting and citizenship and all of those kinds of things. So he's linking himself up to Jefferson, the Declaration, to the founders, and saying, this is sort of a march of history kind of thing, that we started this way. Now this is the next phase, and presumably there would be other phases as we continue on.
Well, let me just ask you about two other phases and then we can finish. In the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, where women met in Seneca Falls to declare rights, they adopted in the Declaration of Sentiments language that said, we hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Mm-hmm. So there, they invoked the Declaration. Mm-hmm. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., in his wonderful speech at the March on Washington, invokes the Declaration by saying, I have a dream. It's deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this people will rise up and recognize that all men are created equal. I have a dream. Is this the cornerstone of American constitutional law, in essence? I mean, to me it is, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, many people have said that. I mean, Jim Oakes has written a book, who's also in the Willens camp, about the Constitution, saying that the Declaration gives the Constitution a sort of spirit, its meaning, that's what it's supposed to, that the two of them are linked. We see them as separate documents. But yeah, so that's supposedly the American creed, the animating principle of our laws and our system of government. And so if we think about what those things mean, the notions of equality, liberty and pursuit of happiness, all of those kinds of things, particularly the equality and liberty, are, people see them as opposition, but the struggle is how to make them have meaning together, because they can be seen together, and one is dependent upon the other, actually. So I do think that the Declaration is a part of the Constitution, the spirit of the Constitution.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.